Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive into some serious history today, huh? We're tackling the U.S. immigration debate of the late 20th century.
A fascinating period for sure.
Yeah, and to guide us, we've got an episode from Mr. Hutchings History, Part 1 of the Great Immigration Debate. We're going to see how California became this battleground, all the economic and cultural clashes. It's going to be good.
Oh, it's a period that really reveals those fault lines in American identity, especially when it comes to Hispanic Americans.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1994, California's hit with a recession. People are on edge.
Not a good combination.
And then, boom, Proposition 187 hits the scene. This thing tried to block undocumented immigrants from getting public education, healthcare, even social services. And get this, it actually passed with like 59% of the vote.
It really shows how economic anxieties can, well, unfortunately, sometimes lead to policies that target specific groups.
Yeah, and of course, it was later ruled unconstitutional. But the impact, it was huge.
No doubt. It sparked this whole political firestorm.
Totally. You had figures like Governor Pete Wilson, who really championed Prop 187, even going as far as questioning birthright citizenship. Can you believe that?
It was a radical stance for sure.
And on the flip side, you had folks like journalist Robert Scheer calling out the hypocrisy, saying, hey, California's economy relies on immigrant labor, but then they try to deny basic services to their kids.
It was a powerful critique of the inconsistencies in the arguments for the proposition.
Yeah, and this clash of viewpoints blew the whole thing up onto the national stage. But here's the wild part. Even though Prop 187 got struck down, it was like this catalyst. It led to a surge in political activism, especially within the Hispanic community. Voter registration, participation, it all went through the roof.
It's often the case that attempts to marginalize a group can end up galvanizing them, giving them a greater sense of purpose and solidarity.
Okay, so let's talk about the economics of it all. Back then, and even now, the economic impact of immigrants is this hot-button issue. And our source material, it really digs into this whole tug of war.
Yeah, it does a good job of presenting those different perspectives.
So on one hand, there's the worry about job displacement. The argument is that immigrants are taking jobs from American citizens.
That was, and still is, a common concern.
Then there's the whole wage suppression thing, the idea that immigrants might be willing to work for less, driving down wages for everyone.
Right, and some also pointed to the issue of remittances.
Remittances.
Yeah, the money immigrants send back to their families in their home countries. Some argued this was, like, draining the U.S. economy.
But then those in favor of immigration, they argued that immigrants often do those essential but, less desirable jobs, agriculture, construction, that kind of thing, the jobs a lot of Americans didn't want.
Jobs that are vital to the economy, but often overlooked.
Exactly. And they stressed how immigrants contribute to economic growth, both through their work and by starting businesses. The source even mentions this Gallup poll from 2000. 62% of Americans felt immigration was hurting the economy, but a whopping 75% acknowledged that immigrants were essential for filling those, those vital but maybe less appealing jobs.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? This fear of economic impact, but also recognizing their necessity.
It really shows how complex this issue is. But it wasn't just about the money, right? It was about cultural anxieties, too. There was this big question. Are immigrants, particularly Latinos, assimilating into mainstream American culture?
That question was at the heart of a lot of the debate.
Yeah, and figures like Pat Buchanan and Senator Alan Simpson, they were worried about ethnic enclaves, saying they were hurting national unity. And then there was the whole thing about the rise of Spanish-language media.
They saw it as a barrier to assimilation.
It's crazy to think that by the year 2000, there were 533 Spanish-language radio stations in the U.S.
It was a testament to the growing influence of Latino culture.
But while some saw it as a threat, Latino advocacy groups, they celebrated this bilingualism, the cultural richness that immigrants brought to America. So it was this clash of values assimilation versus diversity.
A fundamental tension that continues to play out in different ways today.
And sometimes this clash took a dark turn. Critics started linking immigration to rising crime rates, pointing to incidents in places like Los Angeles. But others pushed back, saying, hey, it's not being an immigrant that causes crime. It's poverty, lack of opportunity, those systemic issues.
That's a crucial point. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Right. We can't just jump to conclusions. It's like, how did historians even begin to untangle all this? So we've got economic worries, cultural anxieties, all these different pieces of the puzzle. It makes you wonder, how did historians make sense of this whole heated debate?
Well, they bring a bunch of different perspectives to the table, each one shedding light on different parts of this really complex issue. For example, you've got social historians like Vicky Ruiz. They focus on the lived experiences of immigrants, their struggles, their resilience, how they adapted to this new culture.
It's like trying to see the human side of these big historical events. What about those who look at this debate through the lens of critical race theory? What do they see?
Well, critical race theory, or CRT, it looks at how race and racism are baked into our systems and structures. Scholars like Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, they argue that this debate wasn't just about economics or culture, it was about the racialization of Latino immigrants. The way they were seen, often treated as a threat simply because of their ethnicity.
That adds a whole other dimension to the conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, what about the economic historians? They must have a field day with this topic.
Oh, they do. Economic historians like David Card have really dug into how immigration affects the labor market. And what they've found often challenges that idea that immigrants steal jobs or lower wages. Actually, lots of studies show that immigrants and native-born workers, they often complement each other in the job market, filling different roles and contributing to overall economic growth.
So it's not a simple either-or situation. But what about the political side of things? How have political historians tackled this debate?
Political historians like Guy have really dug into the contradictions in U.S. immigration policy. They point out how the U.S. has relied on immigrant labor throughout history, but at the same time put up all these restrictive measures. It's like this push and pull that both welcomes and excludes immigrants.
It's this constant tension between needing workers and being afraid of the other.
Yeah.
But beyond all the academic analysis, it's important to remember that this debate happened against a backdrop of real anxieties. The 1990s were a time of major economic and social change.
Absolutely. Globalization was speeding up, automation was changing industries, and a lot of Americans were feeling economically insecure. Those anxieties definitely played a role in how people felt about immigration.
It's like people were looking for someone to blame for all these economic shifts, and immigrants became an easy target.
And those anxieties were often amplified by certain politicians and media figures who used inflammatory rhetoric to stoke public fear and resentment. They tapped into this us versus them mentality, framing immigrants as a threat to American jobs, culture, and even security. Remember, this was also the era of the culture wars, with debates raging about national identity and the so-called American way of life.
So the fear of immigrants not assimilating was part of a bigger anxiety about the changing face of America.
Exactly. For some, the influx of immigrants, particularly from Latin America, seemed to challenge a traditional vision of what it meant to be American. The growing visibility of Latino culture, the language, the music, the food, fueled those concerns about assimilation.
And we see this play out in debates about language, right? You mentioned earlier those concerns about Spanish language media hindering integration into American society.
Yes, and it's worth noting that this fear of language diversity wasn't new. Throughout U.S. history, there have been periods of anxiety about the role of languages other than English. But in the context of the late 20th century, with the rise of Spanish language media and the increasing number of Spanish speakers, these concerns became particularly acute.
I guess when people are already feeling anxious about economic and cultural changes, language can become a very potent symbol, a focal point for those anxieties.
Precisely. And these cultural and economic anxieties often became intertwined. The perception, whether accurate or not, that immigrants were taking jobs away from American citizens, driving down wages, and straining social services, these concerns fueled the debate and shaped public policy.
We see this most clearly with Proposition 187 in California. It was largely driven by the belief that undocumented immigrants were a drain on the state's resources.
It's a stark reminder that even in a nation built on immigration, the fear of the other can lead to the implementation of exclusionary policies. And these fears were often exploited for political gain.
It's like a vicious cycle. Economic anxiety fuels cultural fear, which then gets exploited for political purposes.
And unfortunately, those fears often overshadowed the individual stories of immigrants, their hard work, their aspirations, their contributions to American society. It's crucial to remember that behind the statistics and the political rhetoric, there are real people with families, dreams, and the desire to build a better life.
It's about recognizing their humanity, their resilience, their shared hopes and struggles. We can't let fear and prejudice blind us to those fundamental human connections.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the immigrant community wasn't passive during this period. They organized, they mobilized, they fought for their rights and their place in American society.
Right. They weren't just objects of this debate. They were active participants, shaping the narrative and pushing for change.
And this brings us to a truly fascinating aspect of this era: the rise of Latino political power in the U.S. The very forces that sought to marginalize and exclude immigrants inadvertently contributed to their empowerment.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
But how exactly did this political awakening happen?
Well, think about Proposition 187. As much as it was a setback, it really energized the Latino community. There was this huge increase in voter registration and activism.
It's like they were saying, you want to push us out? Well, we'll push back by getting more involved.
Exactly. Latino advocacy groups became more prominent, and politicians couldn't ignore the growing political power of Latino voters anymore.
It's incredible how this attempt to marginalize a group actually helped them gain power.
This surge in political participation wasn't just in California either. Across the country, Latinos were mobilizing, demanding a seat at the table, making their voices heard.
It makes you realize that the American story is always being written, and each generation adds its own chapter to that ongoing narrative of struggle and progress.
Absolutely. And this period marked a turning point in the story of Hispanic Americans, as they went from being largely overlooked to becoming a powerful force in shaping the nation's political landscape.
It's a testament to the enduring power of the American dream, the idea that no matter where you come from or what obstacles you face, you can achieve success and create a better life for yourself and your children.
And that dream has always been intertwined with the immigrant experience. Generation after generation, immigrants have come to America seeking opportunity, freedom, and a chance to contribute to the nation's tapestry.
It's that spirit of hope, resilience, and determination that continues to inspire. But as we wrap up our deep dive into this chapter of American history, it's clear that the immigration debate is far from settled. It continues to resonate in our political discourse and policy decisions.
Absolutely. From debates over border security to discussions about a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, these issues remain at the forefront of our national conversation.
And these aren't just abstract political issues. They have real-world consequences for millions of people.
Exactly. The decisions we make as a nation will shape the lives of countless individuals and families, impacting their opportunities, their sense of belonging, and their ability to pursue their dreams.
So as we move forward, it's crucial that we engage in these discussions thoughtfully, respectfully, and with a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
And it's important to remember that behind the statistics and the political rhetoric, there are real human stories, stories of struggle, resilience, hope, and the pursuit of a better life.
It's those stories that should guide our actions and shape our policies. Because ultimately, the immigration debate is not just about laws or economics or even culture. It's about who we are as a nation and what we stand for.
It's about whether we choose to embrace our history as a nation of immigrants or whether we turn our backs on that legacy. It's about whether we choose to build a society that welcomes and celebrates diversity or one that succumbs to fear and division.
It's a choice that we all have to make, individually and collectively. So as you continue to explore the world and engage with these complex issues, consider how your own beliefs and assumptions shape your perspective. What steps can you take to approach these discussions with empathy, understanding, and a commitment to finding common ground?
The immigration debate is a reflection of our values, our hopes, and our fears, and it's a debate that will continue to shape the future of our nation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly pivotal chapter of American history. We hope it's given you a new understanding of the complexities of the immigration debate and its lasting impact on our society. So we've got all these different pieces, economic worries, cultural anxieties. It's a lot to untangle. How do historians even make sense of it all?
Well, they look at it from a bunch of different angles, each one bringing its own insights, like social historians, for instance.
Okay, yeah.
Think of someone like Vicky Ruse. They really focus on the lives of immigrants themselves, their struggles, how they adapted, their resilience in building new lives.
So it's like getting the human story behind the big headlines.
Right.
What about those who view this through the lens of critical race theory? What do they add to the mix?
Well, critical race theory, or CRT, looks at how race and racism are woven into our systems. Scholars like Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, when they look at immigration, they argue it wasn't just about economics or culture. It was about the way Latino immigrants were racialized, seen, and treated as a threat, simply because of their ethnicity.
That definitely adds a whole other layer to the conversation. What about the economic historians? This must be their bread and butter.
Yeah, absolutely. They love digging into this stuff. People like David Card, they've done some serious analysis on how immigration impacts the job market. And what's interesting is their findings often challenge the idea that immigrants steal jobs or drive down wages.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of studies actually show that immigrants and native-born workers, they kind of work together, filling different roles and actually boosting the economy.
So it's not as simple as some people make it sound? But what about the political side of it all? How have political historians approached this?
Political historians, folks like Matt and Guy, they've highlighted the contradictions in U.S. immigration policy. They point out how this country has relied on immigrant labor throughout its history, but then, at the same time, put up all these roadblocks. It's this weird push and pull, welcoming and excluding at the same time.
It's like this constant tension between needing workers and fearing the other, right?
Exactly.
But even beyond the academic analysis, we can't forget that this debate happened during a time of, well, real anxiety for a lot of people.
Absolutely. The 1990s were a time of major change, economically and socially.
Right. Things were shifting.
Globalization was accelerating, automation was transforming industries. A lot of Americans were feeling really insecure about their jobs and their future, and that anxiety, well, it played a role in how people viewed immigration.
Makes sense. Like, if people are looking for someone to blame for their problems, immigrants can become an easy target.
Unfortunately, yes. And those anxieties were often fueled by politicians and media figures who used inflammatory rhetoric to, stir up fear and resentment. They painted this picture of us versus them, framing immigrants as a threat to the American way of life.
So the fear of immigrants not assimilating, that was part of a bigger fear about America changing, right?
Exactly. For some, the influx of immigrants, especially Latinos, seemed to challenge their vision of what America should be. The growing presence of Latino culture, the language, music, food, it all contributed to those concerns about assimilation.
And this plays out in those debates about language, doesn't it? Like you mentioned, some people worried that Spanish language media would make it harder for immigrants to integrate.
Right, and it's worth noting that this fear of language diversity wasn't new. Throughout U.S. history, there have been times when people worried about the role of languages other than English. But in the late 20th century, with more Spanish language media and more Spanish speakers, those concerns became even more intense.
I guess when people are already anxious about other changes, language can become a lightning rod for those anxieties.
Exactly. And all these cultural and economic anxieties, they often became intertwined. The perception, whether it was accurate or not, that immigrants were taking jobs, driving down wages, putting a strain on social services, it all fueled the debate and influenced public policy.
Yeah, we see that clearly with Proposition 187 in California. That whole thing was driven by the belief that undocumented immigrants were draining the state's resources.
Right. It's a reminder that even in a nation built on immigration, fear and prejudice can lead to exclusionary policies. And sadly, those fears were often manipulated for political gain.
So it's like this vicious cycle, right? Economic anxiety leads to cultural fear, and then politicians exploit those fears for their own benefit.
Exactly. And all too often, those fears overshadowed the individual stories of immigrants, their hard work, their aspirations, the contributions they made to society. We have to remember that behind the statistics and the political rhetoric, there are real people with families, dreams, and the desire to build a better life.
It's about seeing their humanity, their resilience, recognizing that we all share the same hopes and struggles. We can't let fear and prejudice blind us to that.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that immigrants weren't just passive victims in all of this. They organized, they fought for their rights, they demanded a place in American society.
Right? They weren't just sitting back and letting things happen to them. They were actively pushing for change.
And that brings us to one of the most fascinating developments of this era, the rise of Latino political power in the U.S. It's almost ironic that the very forces that tried to marginalize immigrants ended up empowering them.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
But how did this political awakening actually happen? What were the key moments that led to this shift?
Well, think about Proposition 187.
Yeah.
As much as it was a setback, it really energized the Latino community. Like it was this wake-up call.
Right. It's like they said, you want to push us out, fine, but we're not going anywhere, and we're going to make our voices heard.
Exactly. There was this huge increase in voter registration, more activism, more organization.
So they basically turned this attempt to exclude them into fuel for their political rise.
Exactly. Latino advocacy groups became much more prominent. Politicians, they couldn't ignore the growing Latino vote anymore.
It's pretty amazing how this attempt to marginalize a group actually ended up empowering them.
It happens a lot throughout history.
So this surge in political participation, it wasn't just limited to California, was
No,
there?
not at all. It was happening across the country. Latinos were mobilizing, getting organized, demanding a seat at the table, and making sure they were heard in the halls of power.
It's like a reminder that the American story is always being written, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And each generation adds its own chapter to that story of struggle and progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this period, it marked a real turning point for Hispanic Americans. They went from being largely overlooked to being a real political force,
Right.
a force to be reckoned with.
And it speaks to the power of the American dream, you know? That idea that no matter who you are, where you come from, you can succeed and create a better life.
And that dream has always been tied to immigration, right?
Mhm.
Generation after generation coming to America, looking for opportunity, for freedom, for a chance to contribute.
It's that spirit of hope, that resilience that's so inspiring. But as we wrap up our deep dive here, it's pretty clear the immigration debate isn't over, is it?
Not by a long shot.
It's still a huge part of our political discussions and decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, just look at the debates over border security, the whole question of a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. These issues are still front and center.
And these aren't just theoretical debates. Right?
No, not at all. These are issues that have real consequences for millions of people.
Real lives are at stake.
Exactly. What we do as a nation, the choices we make, they're going to shape the lives of families, their opportunities, their sense of belonging, their ability to build a future.
So as we move forward, we have to approach these discussions with more thoughtfulness, more respect, with a real willingness to listen to each other.
Yeah, we can't just shout at each other. We have to listen. And remember, behind the statistics, the political arguments, there are real people, real stories. Stories of struggle, of resilience, of hope, of the pursuit of a better life.
And it's those stories that should guide us. Because ultimately, this whole immigration debate, it's not just about laws or economics or even culture. It's about who we are as a nation. What do we stand for?
It's about whether we embrace our history as a nation of immigrants or turn our backs on it. Whether we build a society that's welcoming and celebrates diversity or one that gives in to fear and division.
It's a choice we all have to make, individually and collectively. So as you go about your lives, as you encounter these issues, think about how your own beliefs, your own experiences, shape the way you see things. What can you do to engage in these discussions with more empathy, more understanding, more commitment to finding common ground?
The immigration debate really reflects our values, our hopes, our fears. And it's a debate that's going to continue to shape the future of this country.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly pivotal chapter in American history. We hope it's given you some food for thought, a better understanding of the complexities of the immigration debate, and its impact on all of us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.